You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
My sensitive topic is actually the untimely death of Don, and the impact it had on those of us very close to him. And because he was very young, he was only 50 years old. And it was obviously the tragic loss to his family and kids is, our loss is trivial compared to that in a weird way. So I don't want to, but it was a very weird sort of journey because, he was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. He then got a relief because they said, oh, no, that was a misdiagnosis. It's only pancreatitis. And then he had the real diagnosis again reconfirmed. And that's all within from Memorial Day to, the beginning of the summer kind of period of time. And then, he goes into experimental treatment. He still is coming around in the fall, but he passes away in the fall, roughly 6 months from diagnosis to his death. So it was very fast kind of thing too, not drawn out, not years of battle and all of that. And also again, while he was extremely weakened, he still found time for many times into that fall still to show up to the seminar and discuss ideas and these kind of things. And so his example of the life of the mind and the way that he pursued it was something, and I think different people react to tragedies of losing someone differently. And how did you process that? You're a young person, your mentor is, unexpectedly passes away, and you have to then process that and think about how to move forward and what you do with that.
I mean, in some sense, that's my first loss as an adult, right? Which is also the kind of thing. But so you talk about that trajectory. It in some sense it immediately the diagnosis had a change, sort of an effect, on me, and so I just finished drafting my dissertation proposal, and he was insistent that it be a book, and so it was a proposal for a book essentially, and so I just finished drafting my dissertation proposal. I had sent it to him. We were scheduled to meet to discuss the proposal. And we have the meeting, we discuss the proposal, and then he says, well, so I have some bad news. And he tells me about the diagnosis. This is sort of the initial thing, and the prognosis is really bad, and he sort of lays this out. And so I'm going to immediately struck by two things. One, why in the world are we spending all this time talking about this stupid book proposal? It's, whatever. Yeah. When this is what you're dealing with, right? But that was important to him and critical to him, and he did it. But he got it out. He did it first.
Yeah.
Right. And so that sort of had an impression on me. And the second sort of thing was, it was just in many ways it's overwhelming. You said, how do I deal with this? And I think I came out of there, sort of we had the heard about the potential reprieve, and then no, it really is this. And I ended up making a couple of decisions. One, I had a offer for. I was sort of going in my dissertation. I had an offer for a dissertation fellowship on the table, and I turned it down. and I had a job offer from the consulting firm that I'd worked with on the table, and I took it. And my thinking there was, I had not yet had an opportunity to write with Don. We talked about writing together and what have you, but we just hadn't done it. We just hadn't had time to do it. And he had said very clearly that he wanted to continue to work throughout as long as he could. And so I was like, well, I'm not going to finish my dissertation. And so it would have been, I couldn't accept the dissertation. I couldn't in clear conscience accept the dissertation fellowship, knowing that I had really no intent to work on my dissertation during that year, hopefully. And I was hoping it was a year. And so and the place where I was working said they'd give me the space to do research. And so I took that job, and we spent that summer talking about a couple of papers that we were working on together. One was the Dewey one that he and I co-authored, and one was a paper on Gadamer that he and I wrote. And so we spent the time talking about that, and that he, as he got sicker, he would, his wife Mary was like, had some tremendous opportunity in some sense, although really sad. It was like, he has his chemos, they're really hard on him, but one thing that seems to be good for him is to be distracted by talking about ideas. And so took him to chemo, and talked economics on the way to chemo, and then, even on the way back, as he was tired, he would still want to talk economics, and so we did that. That my last in-person meeting with him was about the final paper that we wrote together, where he was like, I'll finish the conclusion and send it to you. And we would, so we talked about where the paper was and what the draft, the parts of the draft that I'd given him, and he finished the conclusion, didn't send it to me, and then had a stroke. And so Mary, I ended up getting the paper because Mary said, I know he was working on this, go on his computer and see if you can find it. But that was sort of like my, and so that was, I remember I had to present that paper at the Southern Economic Association meetings, which, he dies, a few weeks before. And I'm in my room in tears before the presentation. I managed to give the presentation somehow, and then I'm in tears in my room, after the presentation. And then for months, I didn't want to work on, getting back to my dissertation was I had a job that I liked. And so I was just like, well, maybe I won't do this. And the thing that brought me back into academics was really that you and Jack High were putting on a conference to honor Don, and then Jack was following it up with a edited volume that he was going to do, and I got invited to write a paper on the edited volume, and it was about Don, so I couldn't, I obviously had to say yes to that. And then I sort of got into scholarship again, and then you decide, you stepped in and chaired the dissertation. Jack stepped in to be an additional member of the dissertation, and so that's sort of what pushed me to finish. But I still, for a long while, didn't sort of live this life outside. I was doing articles and stuff like that, but I was living this life outside of the academic world, and in some sense because of that decision that I made when he got sick.
I mean, I'm going to have a conversation with Dave Perchicko later this semester, and but I think Dave also, I mean, a lot of circumstances happened in Dave's life that reoriented his priorities, but I think this was one of them. I mean, Dave flew out from Michigan, and we sat with Don in his bedroom, actually. And late in the diagnosis, not as late as you were just talking about, but Don was he was immobile, by this time. And we sat and talked, and it's interesting. My memory of that conversation is that it's one of the conversations where I gladly listened a lot more than I spoke in my life, because I wanted to hear every word that came out of his mouth. I think of Don, and again, people have different impressions in these kind of difficult circumstances. But to me, he was, the way he and Mary faced that day, peaceful, graceful, serene in a way that was beyond my imagination to be able to do. It really has, it had a major impact on me, because I wanted to make sure that whatever we did at Mason was something that Don would have, said, like, okay, that's a cool thing that you're doing. Yeah. And it's been a constant reminder of all the things that go on. So anyway, all right. We shared that experience, and obviously it's like being the siblings in a household. You all have the same parents, but your experience is different the way you're raised. And so it's kind of fascinating to me to see how in my cohort, Steve and Horowitz and Dave Perchitko and Emily and myself all wrestled with that, as opposed to other people, and what we did in response to it and whatnot. It's about commitment to teaching and honoring the kind of values that he put up. One of the things that I wanted to also ask you about, because you've spent a large part of your, a chunk of your intellectual life at Mercatus. Tyler and I have as well. And one of the things about Mercatus is there's a continuity in the 40 years, but there's also a constant reinventing. I'm trying to think of like an artist that does that as well, that reinvent themselves, over time, so that they can become artists for the different generations or whatever, or athletes that reinvent themselves on teams and the way that they do that. And I was wondering what do you think about all of that, and why is it that this organization has been, in some sense, as adaptable and as flexible as it has been, as opposed to having an arc in which it serves a purpose and then dies out, right? Why? How's it able to do this? And
I've thought a lot about that. Like, I think the secret sauce is actually the thing that hasn't changed throughout the whole time, which is the mission of the organization. Right. And so it's an organization that has a mission that's sort of driven by trying to, sort of understand the world of free and responsible individuals, and what the circumstances need to be that enable that world to come about, and what the consequences of that world are. And so that's a mission that even in its different identities sort of ran through the organization, right? And it sort of is, and that kind of because that hasn't changed, but the problems of the world have changed in some instances. The personalities involved have changed. The kinds of questions that are interesting and driving us have changed. The opportunities, both intellectual opportunities, but also programmatic opportunities have changed. The resources have changed, but the mission stayed the same. That we've sort of managed to both be the same organization and be flexible and growing and adaptable and all these kinds of things that are super cool. And so I think that when you see organizations that don't that sort of tap out, there's sort of one of two things that are happening there. It's either that the mission itself is a limiting mission as opposed to an opening up mission, right? That ours is, let's try to understand the world, let's try to, and then let's try to, maybe push the world or change the world in a way that sort of like takes advantage of that understanding to make the world a better place. And so that might, so we have a mission that sort of encourages and promotes and pushes innovation. So we don't have a limiting mission, but we also haven't been changing the mission to like catch up with the latest whatever latest fad or latest fashion. And so then we're not sort of subject to, oh well, we didn't guess right what the next fad was, right? That that when I think about, it's true of me, I think it's how I think about scholarship too. In many ways, I think about scholarship and academic entrepreneurship in the same way, which is that what are the gaps, right? So I clearly have a perspective, and I have a certain set of interests. Mercatus as an organization has a certain set of interests. It's a certain we're a certain kind of organization with a certain kind of mission, and that the gaps in many ways bother me. And so so you think about, like the reason why we have something like a Smith Fellowship, or a Boettke Fellowship, or a Morgenstern Fellowship, or now a Lavoie Fellowship. We've talked a lot about Lavoie, is because there were gaps in the the social scientific training of the majority of graduate students around the world. That there was this rich set of ideas about how to make sense of the world that they weren't even encountering, and that was a set of ideas that we had a particular skill set in and comparative advantage in, and that gap then became intolerable in a lot of ways. And so like, how do we fill that gap? That's the same way I sort of think about, like, why am I talking about culture and economy, or like, markets and sociality or markets and morality? It's because that's an intolerable gap in the literature that in many ways is huge, not small, not a small one. It's not a footnote type gap. They're big ones. And so I'm trying to I think that's not just me. I think there's a lot of people at Mercatus who think about that. The mission in that way, and the way we advance the mission in that way.
Yeah, I think that you hit on to something there. Two things, I think. One of them is that the not fad issue. And I think this is one of the things that people totally misunderstood about Don, was that hermeneutics was not a fad. All right. It's a philosophy of reading, of learning and discourse. And if there's some continuity that is involved in all of our programs, it is reading and discussion. The centerpiece of everything that we do is reading and discussion. So it's not just learning to perform as truffle hounds at academic dog shows. The main intellectual activity that our graduate students are engaged in is reading groups, or reading of papers and discussing of ideas, even more so than learning how to present an idea. So rather than the idea of learning how to give a slick presentation, which we try to do now because they have to do that, and I understand that, But for the first 3 years of graduate school, most of them are discussing ideas where there's no presentation even given. It's just, let's just jump into the ideas. Yeah. There's no lecture given. You presume you did that prior, so you can just jump into it and have that conversation. The levels of reading groups and everything, that was all Don, right? Yeah. That started with Don, and it was about learning how to read, and read charitably and thoroughly. And hermeneutics is a philosophy. I mean, it's ancient. It goes, it's not something that was, just limited to, postmodernist culture in the 1970s or something like that. And so it was really this issue, and that being part of it. And the second one is that recognizing what cheapens a conversation. So you mentioned earlier about the idea of the no shortcuts. Why no shortcuts, right? Isn't there great gains from parsimony? Well, we can be too thin for our own good, was part of Don's argument. And we need to not cheapen the conversation in the social sciences about, and humanity. So, which is all ultimately about the human condition, which is why it is that he was drawn to Hannah Arendt, and this idea of our frameworks as being like a set of eyeglasses from which we read, and that history is the greatest book that we ever get to read, and so that we should be embracing that, and all of that. And I think that there was something unique about a center that was started by Rich and Jack and Don that put the primary focus on the students in the program and the learning in the program above the comfort level of the faculty in the program. So this goes back to your generosity of time idea. Most centers, quote unquote centers, they end up by becoming very valuable to professors because they are the reason or the resources why the professor gets time to not have to teach, not have to meet with other people, can sit, basically live their life like we've all been living for the last 8 months if we wanted to, which is away from everyone with our books around us and our computers, and that's it. And, that wasn't what we're supposed to do, because we're supposed to meet and discuss ideas in this way. And so it's fascinating. I wanted to, look, you're a very accomplished scholar. The number of books that you've done and the number of journal articles that you've written across the board. What you mentioned before is that, in philosophy, in sociology, in science, the work that you've done with Ginny on that, and of course in economics. So, you've accomplished a lot as a scholar. You have tremendous mentoring abilities with these young people that you've mentored over the last decade, who have now developed their own careers, and you can look at their library emerging of their own books and their own careers and everything like that. But you've also been an amazing educational innovator. And I guess you already kind of hinted at what it is, which is that the gaps scratch at your mind and you figure out ways to fix that. But, talk a little bit about those programs and what gaps. I mean, I know you hate to talk about it, but what gaps are they filling in a different way? And what excites you most about what possibilities we could do in even in this difficult space like today? Like what we face today, we face all kinds of challenges for a lot of our educational programs, but there's a scratch that needs to be, an itch that needs to be scratched, and we're figuring out a way to try to satisfy that, and maybe just a little, not so like elaborate bragging about it, but just
I'll talk. Maybe I'll do a given the purposes, maybe I'll do a history, and so like that'll be and because I think that speaks to this kind of question. And so I was hired by Mercatus in 2007 as the director of graduate student programs. And I was tasked with two things really. One was we'd had an existing PhD fellowship, and it supported I think 12 to 15 students a year, and it had been supporting that number for, back from when I was a graduate student and
Right.
before. And there was a sort of a decision that maybe we should attempt to grow that. And so and so one of the things was, figure out how to grow that from, 15 to 25 students. And then the second thing was, we think, and this is sort of when I was talking about like early on that the center hadn't yet figured out what its relationship with graduate students, at least the policy part of the center hadn't yet figured out what its relationship with graduate students should be. The second thing was, we think we have, we think that maybe we can start a master's fellowship that's for students who are interested in applied economics.
Right.
And so start that, figure out what that ought to be and grow that. And so the first thing was really developing that master's fellowship as a sort of training opportunity for students for whom, say, a PhD would have been an overinvestment. They weren't interested in going into academia. And so the kinds of, the educational experiences that they would get in a PhD fellowship, in a PhD program, weren't exactly right. So what they really would benefit from was, by then, Mercatus had become, a policy, it had a policy research center that had people who were committed to doing, sort of serious and, policy scholarship, not, and that, and so, so the first thing was developing that as a fellowship where they got a in-classroom set of experiences that would train them to be, policy analysts, essentially economic policy analysts, and a set of out-of-classroom experiences that were a kind of apprenticeship in policy scholarship, and policy analysis. And so that was the Mercatus Fellowship. And we, and so they went on for a bit. And one of the things that it's just talked about the gap was that we would constantly, and this would happen at conferences you'd go to, whatever, you'd encounter graduate students, sometimes graduate students that really, sort of high ranked or, institutions that had really great reputations, that just sort of weren't aware that, there were these Nobel laureates who did this interesting work in this aspect of political economy, and that their work might benefit from engaging that, right? And so they, this notion wasn't that they needed to become, Austrian economists or public choice economists or sort of Ostrom-style institutional economists, but that there was this work out there that, in fact, their own questions and their own problems would benefit from their awareness of. And so you sort of like that's, and so it was like, okay, well, can we figure out a way that we could expose students from a variety of institutions, not at Mason, to these approaches to political economy that we sort of have this unique skill set and orientation. And so that's where the Smith Fellowship came from. And as you were saying before, like the values that Dawn had, it's entirely a discussion-based program. Because again, the purpose isn't we're going to it's a conversion experience where we're meant to put people in we take students in and they come out Austrian economists or something like that. It's no, we think that there's something valuable here that might be useful for your own set of questions and your own set of ideas and for your own advancement of your scholarly program, that if you were aware of, you might do a better job of. And the only way for you to figure that out or not is to actually be introduced to those ideas, but then have a discussion.
Yeah.
about that, and like how that, what the flaws are, what the holes are, what your questions that you might have to that. And so that's where the Smith Fellowship came from. And over time, two things, again, you talk about the gaps, the two things presented themselves as being pretty obvious. That if you were, that this was interesting to more than just economists. That in fact, many graduate students outside of economics and philosophy and political science and sociology and musicology and what have you would find real benefit from engaging these ideas, and having these kinds of conversations, and that in fact the interdisciplinary conversation around them would be richer than if it were just economists. And so that program sort of evolved to be much more interdisciplinary, certainly in terms of its students.
Yeah.
And so that meant, but that again, that revealed two things. One, if you were an economist, it almost didn't tick the right boxes for you. Like if you were sort of a classically trained economist at a standard program, it sort of put you in a situation where you were discussing the limits of the techniques and approaches to economics that you were being trained in. Like those things that I was telling you way back at the beginning of this conversation, that I was like acutely aware of being real challenges, and didn't give you enough space to adjudicate between how to reconcile those limits with what you in fact then were doing in your program. And so the Morgenstern Fellowship flowed out of that. It was like, okay, what kind of conversation can we cultivate that would allow students that were economic students and maybe quantitatively trained political science students to engage in these ideas, but in a way that was productive for them, not sort of problematic for them. The other sort of, ideal-typical student that wasn't being well served by the Smith Fellowship was if you really had a policy bent. Because it's not a space where we talk about, policy in any sort of way, right? Like it's sort of, we don't talk about policy analysis in that. If it comes up in the conversation, it's third or fourth order kind of, intervention. It's not really what the conversation there was about. And so can we create a space for students who are interested in the way Mercatus does policy analysis and policy research? And, the sort of built on this. And so that's where the Boettke Fellowship came from. And all three of those fellowships now have, that I've been pleasantly surprised and sort of awed by just sort of the quality of students that are engaged in those programs, not just quality in terms of the institutions that they come from, but the sort of the scholarly commitment of the students engaged in that program, and the depth of engagement that they have with those ideas and what have you. And so we've been trying to, with each of those programs individually, we've been trying to see if we could create opportunities for them to have even deeper engagement with these ideas, because they themselves have said, hey, we find them valuable. And so then we come to the space, right? So but those are, conversation is fundamental to them. The conversations that happen, not just, sort of in the formal, sessions, but outside at lunch and dinner are critical to them. And then we get to 2020 and we can't do that, right? That we're in a situation where in-person interaction isn't something that we can do safely, in that kind of form. And so the question is, okay, so what do we do about that? Do we, and the one thing we did was we opted not to try to just replicate what we do there over Zoom. The Zoom is a tremendous, or over, some sort of online video conferencing tool that, these are tremendous, right? That I don't know how we would have survived for much of 2020 if we didn't have them, but they have real limits.
Yeah.
And one of the real limits that they have is that they're not the kind of spaces that make for building of relationships, right? Like you can sustain and maybe even deepen relationships that already exist using this kind of format, but it's really a difficult space to have, substantive conversations with strangers about new things that are sort of fundamental and foundational to the way we approach our disciplines and our subjects and the way we go about scholarship or what have you. And so we knew that wasn't going to work. Like we can't just sort of put the Smith Fellowship or whatever fully online. But what it did do is it actually created an opportunity that we wanted to think about, but didn't, which is, can we offer an introduction into the ways, the kinds of scholarship that we do, and the kinds of scholarship that we value, that actually takes advantage of these the technology that we now have available to us, and would that not allow us to expand the range of people who might be able to be involved?
Yeah.
Right. And so we created the Lavoie Fellowship, which is, and it made sense to name it after Lavoie, both because, like all of our programs, it was going to have this commitment to discussion and dialogue, but it also was taking place on this, technological space, which is a thing that you mentioned in being a computer scientist a couple of times. It was something that he valued and he was ahead of. He was ahead of online discussions and stuff like that. He was an innovator in that space. And so it's been actually exciting this past semester, and we're continuing it this semester, and given the responses that we've gotten from students, we'll continue it sort of going forward, which is, it does seem to be serving it. It's exciting how much it seems to be serving its function. Yeah. That although we're not, we're attempting, to have a much more, conversation about works that are much more applied and that are sort of less foundational, that we're not, we're sort of avoiding conversations about philosophy of science, and we're avoiding and methodology and the like, but we're also avoiding, again, sort of foundational sort of concept, the foundational contributions of say Austrian economics or the Virginia School or Bloomington School. We're still managing in that online space to have really, robust discussion.
Yeah.
And that the students still seem to be valuing it more, and it's actually inspired in them a thirst to engage in more of our programs. So that's been exciting to watch and to see, and to, and I've been sort of thrilled with that. So given that we're going to have to be there for the next semester.
Yeah. I've been involved in all of these conversations, and I would say that I think one of the things that might surprise people from the outside looking in is how little gets discussed in any of them about the concrete issues of policy space, as opposed to policy relevant ideas. Maybe is a different kind of idea. But the other thing I wanted to say in response to what you're saying, because I don't know if this was the intent in the way that the programs evolve, but in my own experience, one of the things that I think the program has done so fascinating for our efforts is that it identified holes that we see in our own thinking that can be repaired by combinatorial thinking in a way that we might not have thought about prior. So just as a scholar, let alone as a teacher, but just as a scholar, the conversations that we have, I think, and maybe I'm not the right person to judge it, but if you ask me, I would say that I've become a better scholar because of the conversations that I've had. One of them is a consequence of the fact that in interdisciplinary discussion, all of the reasons why economists are arrogant get flattened. Okay? So, and I might say that that's also true for philosophers. So you have two, rather strong-willed groups in interdisciplinary discourse in the social sciences and the humanities. Economists who think that they have, rigor on their side, and analytic philosophers who, again, think that they have rigor on their side compared to everyone else. And if what you do is you engage in a conversation which sort of flattens that arrogance because you're talking about things that don't necessarily put that as a shut up argument to others, all of a sudden now you're having to like interact with people from where they are and learn and listen and everything. And it's a funny thing, and I'm sure I must have mentioned this to you, but when we first started the Smith Fellowship program, we get these little these things, right? We get a pen, and I'm sitting there, and it's a group of 15, and I'm normally a chatty kind of person or whatever, and I used to put on the top of my my sheet in bold letters, listen. So, right, and another one is Pete, less is more, right? And yeah, I mean, it's just been an amazing experience, I think, for stimulating how it is that I see where the bigger picture of the social sciences and the humanities fit together, and learning from the different takes that different people have.
Yeah. So look, one of the things that's I think critical to that, just sort of echoing what you said, that we're not, so there's a number of scholars at the Mercator Center that are involved in these fellowships, but we're never teachers in that space. We're students in that space.
Right.
Right. And so that we're never, there's no lectures, there's no whiteboards, there's discussion happening in that space. And so because of that, there's, we're open to learning as much as we are to actually, conveying something that's important to them. And that kind of vulnerability that happens in that space is, I think, one of the reasons why it works. The nicest thing that has ever been said about our programs, and I think it's why students, even students who've had that experience for a year, want to come back and do more time with us and want to participate in more of our programs or whatever. And I think it's a value that we can't ever lose, is that, and now a number of them said it, it's that it's what this space is what I expected graduate school to be like. Right. That this is what, like, from as a undergrad dreaming about going to get a PhD somewhere, that what I thought was that I would be in these learning environments where, there wasn't, that ideas were all, I was open to express ideas. I was open to question texts that were not, that we, they have assigned meetings and what have you, but we don't ever treat the text like it's sacred. It's sacred and some that must be, it's like you can criticize it, and that you've actually got people from our, scholars from Mercator who are in that room who are critical of the text that we're reading as well. And that the students who participated in it, again, multiple of them have said, this is what I thought graduate school would be like. And I don't think we can ever, I think that's exciting about the program, but I also think that's a value that we have to hold on to.
One other thing I wanted to say to you, which goes back to your comment about Don and his reading of your papers. So, because I think the fact that we enter into this space not as imposed authorities, but as mutual learners who will be recognized as someone who's thought about these things a lot because of the way that you engage or whatever, but never like that you're a monopoly expert or whatever in the room. That's what enables you to build trust, to have these open conversations. Just like when Don gave you back your paper and it was full of red, which is what he did. He had already earned your trust that he was doing that in good faith, not as a, not as an imposed authority from on high or something like that. It was an authority that you granted to him. I mean, this is a Gadamerarian point, the difference between authority and authoritarianism. And that a lot of education, which is what Don was against in arguing for the democratization of knowledge, right? Which is, again, he was a very early first mover in all of those things. I mean, I think he wrote his first papers on that in the late 80s, early 90s, right? So, and he was working with hypertext before it was cool, and he was interacting with those people in Silicon Valley that are working on those kind of ideas and stuff, and how to develop those educational tools. And in many ways, when we have our discussion group in the Lavoie online, those are just the children of those earlier software things that he was working with, which is pretty amazing to think about. But think about Don. I never got a paper back from him that wasn't full, massively full of red pen, right? But I started getting that from him and meeting with him in the same way you were talking about very early on. And what he did was he reflected that he cared so much about what you were doing that he wanted to help you do it as well as you could do it. And I think that attitude is a lot different from other professors that I've seen that try to criticize people, or editors for that matter, that try to criticize you because you're not making the argument that they would make, right? And they want to use you as a mouthpiece for what they want to say rather than helping you become better than what you are, and you at what you want to do. And I think Don and that culture has stayed with this conversation, and it explains, I think, even it explains both the smoothness of some of the programs and the rough edges on other ones, is because of if that attitude gets lost, then the program starts to not work like what it's supposed to work, and then there becomes all these other things that come up. I mean, it's one of the real great joys of my life that we have done these programs, because I view it as such a great opportunity to continually learn afresh new things that I thought I already knew, but then I learned that I don't know, and so I have to learn some more. All right, just one last question, which is really just to ask you, move away from that educational space now.
Okay. Let's
go back to Virgil Storr, the scholar, who's got books and everything going on. You've been a major. I just gave a lecture yesterday. I just got done discussing. Now I'm going to talk about lecture. But I just gave a lecture yesterday, and the title of the lecture was Relations, Symbolism, Transactions. Okay, and it's sort of someone like Glenn Lowry nowadays likes to run around and say relations before transactions, and. And then on the other hand, we could talk about the symbolic meanings of various different issues that are involved or whatever. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to talk about that you have relations and transactions. You have, choices and symbolism. Symbolism can be in terms of what symbolic meanings you put on these kind of ideas that can relate to approbation and disapprobation, and how it all that, and that we as economists or social scientists that are asking economic questions, if you think about it that way, we have to take into account all of this, core structure of incentives, but at the same time, understanding how it is that different incentives impinge on different people in different spaces because of the meanings that they attribute to it and whatnot. And so the social spaces, it's a long-winded way of me to get to you, which is the social spaces within which all of us interact. That's been a theme of yours for a long, long time. And our ability to access that social space requires us to adopt empirical methods, which are a lot, not so flattened, right? They require us to sort of do this. So as a scholar, where do you see your next sort of movements going? What projects excite you about when you have time in between all these other amazing things that you're doing? Besides being a dedicated husband and a wonderful father, and a great educational entrepreneur, when you find that space, what excites you the most about the projects on your docket?
Yeah, and so I think there's a couple that are exciting, and this will sort of maybe speak to the sort of varied nature of my interest, although I do think there's a kind of core. So I'm currently working on a book with Nona, my wife, on riots and order, and it's sort of motivated. I shouldn't say it's motivated by, but it's timely now because we've been witness to a bunch of this social unrest.
Yeah.
Right. That we've got, in the U.S. in the middle of 2020, even in the midst of a pandemic, we've seen tremendous protest and social upheaval, and some of that some of those events have turned into riots. But we've seen this sort of like happen around the world too. It's not just in the U.S.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that Nona and I are trying to understand in the book, or trying to make sense of the book, is, sort of what, can we understand, how do we understand these events that are themselves disruptors of social order, and what role do they play as sort of disruptors of social order in transforming and bringing about new social orders? But then also, how do we understand these events that appear to be chaotic but are themselves orders? That they're themselves, that the actors within them follow rules. The actors within them are, have certain constraints. The actors in them face certain feedback mechanisms that reward certain kinds of activities and punish or dissuade them from other kinds of activities. And so you've got this sort of interesting interplay of these events that disrupt social order and, change and alter and bring about new social orders as a result of them. But those events, though they appear chaotic, are also orders themselves. And so we're trying to understand, we're trying to lay that out conceptually and theoretically, but then also to sort of apply it to, a case that her dissertation was on, and she wrote up the dissertation on the 1942 riot in the Bahamas, which there was this riot, there was this transformative experience in the history of the country where both of us are from, and so we're using that frame to make sense of that, but then also to see its relevance to to some of these existing riots. And so that's sort of like the project that's the sort of big project that's taking up a lot of mental energy and a lot of focus, and it's sort of, in some ways, the hardest one to talk about because it's the one that I'm right in the middle of now.
Yeah.
It's sort of easier to talk about the project, the things that you've not done yet, or the things that you've done already, but the things that you're in, suddenly they sort of feel a mess. But then I continue to do work, and this is where graduate students are awesome in the sense that they've continued to do work on how communities recover after disasters. Yeah, so continue to do work on how communities recover after disasters. Had Katrina not happened, had sort of COVID not happened, and we'd not been sort of confined, we would have been doing field work this summer in Puerto Rico to look at how that community was recovering after Hurricane Maria.
Right.
And that had planned and have a planned project to do field work in the Bahamas to look at how the Bahamas is recovering after Hurricane Dorian, and continue to do work on the social and moral aspects of markets that some take on sort of use economic experiments to try to reveal some underlying mechanisms that are at work there, but also plan field work with business owners to talk about one a COVID related project about what we've lost. And if the market is really a social space, but we've now had to retreat from market activity as a result of COVID, what's the cost? What's the social cost there of that? And a bunch of other, and so that's like sort of there's a number of projects that are sort of all in either the community recovery space or the social and moral aspects of market space that I'm interested in and continue to work on and expect to keep me busy for a very long time.
Well, that's fantastic. I mean, I think that I teach your papers in my one graduate class and your book in there as well, and it's just fantastic stuff. And so we just got to keep plugging on and keep moving forward. So onward and upward, as they say. Anyway, that's thank you very much, Virgil. I think that we covered a lot of bases there, and we have a lot of work yet to be done. But I think we're consistently adapting and evolving, but at the same time honoring our teacher. And I think that's a great thing that we're doing.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.